I'm Perry Bacon. I'm the host of Right Now. I'm honored to be joined this morning by Jake Grumbach. He's a political scientist at the University of California, Berkeley. He's sort of an all-around expert on lots of things about politics. He's wrote a great book about sort of state politics and how states were changing. He does a lot of interesting research about, he's done some really interesting papers about voter turnout and how moderation maybe is not the solution to all the Democratic Party's problems. But this morning, I want to talk to him about like the indictment of James Comey last night, and in general, kind of where these sort of like quote unquote democracy questions. Jake is a political scientist, but I wanted to intentionally avoid having a lawyer on because I think while there is an indictment and we can discuss the legal terms of it some, I don't think this is worth analyzing in a sort of like purely. You can watch the MSNBC for the lawyers, but I don't think this is actually really a legal story. This is much more of a, in my view, a story about presidents punishing presidents using government authority to punish their enemies. I think is a story here, and that brings us to these democracy questions that Trump raises. So, Jake, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me, Perry.
So this is for people who forgot, like last Friday I think last Friday, the U.S. attorney in Northern Virginia resigned. This is someone who, as far as I know, is a conservative, is a Trump appointee, but he resigned because the administration was pressuring him to indict James Comey and Letitia James, who's the Attorney General of New York, also a person Donald Trump does not like. And so what has happened since then is a new U.S. attorney was appointed, I think Sunday or Monday, and this person appears to have followed Donald Trump's orders to indict Comey. The reporting suggests lots of people in that office and lots of people in the Department of Justice, even people who I said are conservatives, did not think this indictment was worth it legally. And so I want to bring that context. Talk about your reaction to this indictment.
Yeah. So, I mean, this comes in a wave. I think first, it's great to be a non-lawyer on. I'm no big city lawyer. It's good to look at this from a social science perspective and sort of zooming out. Trump has launched investigations or taken sort of steps into launching investigations against the figures in essentially all of the Trump investigations previously, going back to Trump 1. So that's the Russia investigation, the first impeachment attempt, everything around January 6, 2021, and the attempted coup, and investigations into any of the sort of personal bribery and fraud and other civil cases. Um, that is a part of the authoritarian playbook, is to sort of weaponize and make more partisan what are supposed to be impartial forms of the justice system. And the Department of Justice, housed in the executive branch, is supposed to sort of impartially go after various crimes. There's the Civil Rights Division that goes after all sorts of civil rights claims in the DOJ. Typically in administration, it goes after states who are attempting anti-democratic moves like voter suppression or racially biased forms of redistricting and things like that. And they're supposed to go after this in an impartial way. And this is politicizing the Department of Justice. So that, I would say, is part of the authoritarian playbook. Most scholars would agree we're now in some sort of competitive authoritarian situation, not robust liberal democracy. But this is just one piece of the overall slip into competitive authoritarianism that includes, for example, the politicization and firing of experts in the civil service through DOJ and other means. This is around hostile criminal justice investigations of, for example, Lisa Cook and the Fed in wanting the independent Federal Reserve to do different policy. This is coercion of media firms, as we just saw, of universities and law firms. This is ICE and the lack of due process and the sending of troops domestically to sort of cities that are politically misaligned with the Trump administration. All of these are part of the competitive authoritarian playbook. And I just, in zooming out even farther, thanks for shouting out my book, Laboratories Against Democracy, available at any bookstores. But the worries I've had about democratic backsliding in the U.S. for years have been about minority rule. That's like the main form of non-democracy in the U.S. is that some voters, their sort of influence over the balance of power in U.S. politics is much more minimal than others, depending on where you live, depending on how hard your state makes it to vote, depending on your state's redistricting system. All of that is, and the U.S. Senate that gives Wyoming's, about 50 times more voting power in the Senate than New Yorkers and Californians. This is minority rule, and or the Electoral College giving the presidency to, candidates who don't win the majority of the vote. All of those things are real problems for democracy. But now it feels a little quaint when you actually have the executive branch sort of entirely marshaled to maintain its own power. This is a different form. The destruction of sort of liberal democracy and the rule of law is a different topic than the winnowing of a political equality in one person, one vote. So things have really ramped up in 2025 in a different way.
I think somebody was using an analogy of Trump does a Watergate every day, essentially. And I'm trying to remember now, like Watergate is more about we will not about pressing charges, but about ending investigations. But it's almost the same thing as like I'm going to keep firing prosecutors or until I get what I want.
So you had a great point where, so Trump firing his own attorneys in order to get ones that are even more down for the cause, right? So that's an extra sort of wrinkle that just gives like a smoking gun nature to it, right? Doing the same thing with your own without having to fire a lawyer and get like another true believer is just as bad. But what's really funny is like, a lot of Trump appointees will try to do this plausible deniability. For example, the FCC chair Carr around ABC being like, no, I didn't pressure
Right.
ABC to fire Kimmel. And then Trump will just tweet like, I pressured ABC to fire Kimmel. I told Carr to do that. That's a dynamic in the Trump administration that actually, it just adds an element to all of these stories where you see Trump actually articulating these moves in a way that we're not used to other politicians doing. And that's some of the funny it's like if Nixon was not caught on tapes doing this later on, but was out there telling the press, oh yeah, like I told them to, bust my M&A. I told them to break in, to the Watergate Hotel.
It's a good analogy because the tapes were a big thing, but then that was a big thing that Nixon was taped. But like Trump is like literally broadcasting it in a forum daily, exactly what he wants. I'm a little leery about like the defense of democracy being around defending James Comey and Jimmy Kimmel, two rich white guys who probably are not going, who probably be fine. I doubt Comey's going to serve 30 years in jail. Kimmel would have been able to have a show anyway. But what does that tell us? So I think part of the story here is that it is easier to rally around these people for the sort of center left, center right, because they are perceived to be not too liberal. Is that part of the story here?
I think that's part of the story, but I think another part is Trump. I'm a social scientist, I'm a quant. So I like talking about averages and big data and things like that. But Trump is a lot of great man history, like it's just the quirks of Trump as a particular guy. Trump is really into, for example, when we think about Trump's attacks on universities, he's really he's really focused on the Northeast corridor and he got really focused on Harvard.
Really
That's
focus
not
on the
because
second story.
Harvard is like,
Yeah.
the most, paragon of
Right.
university quality and everything. It's that Trump kind of has a thing around it. And the same thing with these players in Trump's
Okay.
orbit. He watches TV, so it's in a lot of ways, it's just driven by Trump stuff. And as a social scientist, that makes it hard to study because same thing with Trump broadcasting his ideas around, I actually need my team to fight. Even Pam Bondi will say, okay, we can't really go after all the enemies in this obvious a way. And he'll say, like, no, we do have to out loud. That is something new and different. And the media struggles with that as well, where it's like, take Trump seriously, not literally, and things like that, and sane washing Trump statements when sometimes he just comes out and says these things. And I'll say to his credit, right? So I really like, I'm a nerd for music and I really like comedy as well. And Trump, I gotta say, like that stuff in a dark way, like it is kind of hilarious to have Trump appointees say, no, we're doing this on the up and up, and then Trump will just parachute in and say no. So same thing with the Erdogan, you know, president or leader of Turkey speaking with Trump, and Trump is out here saying, I got caught up in a rigged election. This guy knows all about rigged elections. These sorts of things are truly remarkable.
You
Like,
have to say them out loud.
yeah, to say them out loud, and it's not something I'm just out here praising, but I want to say, like, compared to Elon Musk, who thinks he's like a comedian and is probably the least funny guy on earth, like Trump does have this sort of mid-century like comedian element. And if you've ever seen him on Wendy Williams, like that's where he would have been an incredibly talented daytime TV host. And it's wild to see it in the executive branch.
Use the term competitive authoritarian. Well, let me come back to this
Yes.
indictment itself. Let me come back to that. Like this in the Kimmel file. There's been a lot of terrible things happened this last year. These are the Kimmel suspension or the pushing him out, and the Comey indictment are kind of kind of among the more explicit things. Is that fair to say?
I think that's right. The Lisa
Um,
Cook fire, I mean, the Lisa Cook investigation of the
Lisa
Fed
Cook,
is up
yes.
there. The firing of the, Bureau of Labor Statistics, when you don't like the numbers, again, saying it right out loud, like those numbers didn't look good for me. The macroeconomic numbers that, essentially financial markets and the capitalist system like count on accurate, objective numbers. And by the way, if you go back to this is just so different. Like the lack of respect for example, objective macroeconomic data. Even like the most conservative coalitions really banked on that. Investors and
Yes.
financiers like hard numbers. And I was watching Trading Places with Eddie Murphy with my big cousin the other week. And you go back and it's like even the highly conservatives in the 80s and 90s movies, when the Department of Agriculture numbers on harvests come out, every investor thinks they're objectively true and respects those numbers. It's a really different world now to have highly politicized, macroeconomic numbers and to explicitly say, I'm cleaning house until those numbers look good for me.
So I read a lot of pieces about what we're experiencing from people who are on the left and people who oppose it. So like people who are Democrats, like left of center, not necessarily socialists. So there are two strands that are sort of competing. One strand is the oh my God, Trump is doing authoritarian things constantly and act like a dictator. That tends to be kind of what I write myself often. There's a second third of people who I respect who will say, actually, if you look at it, Trump is trying to do lots of authoritarian things, but he's sloppy. He gets blocked by courts. He has flimsy, and some of these things don't work. He has terrible poll numbers. He's not very popular. So, where do you like these things can both be true at once, but I tend to emphasize the problem and the fact that he's, indicting and the threat of him. Other people emphasize the sort of, and other people worry that by emphasis, we're overdoing the threat as opposed to the ineptness of him. Kind of talk about that tension and where you see that both those points.
That's nicely put. I think it's a balance because one thing is that authoritarian regimes around the world, we know this in research, they do not like polling results or numbers that show that they're not completely popular because it emboldens a resistance and says, oh, there's others like me out there opposing this regime. I don't have to be totally afraid. And sort of acquiescence and complying in advance is one of the key things powers of authoritarian regimes. And we saw this now with the Kimmel ABC saga does signal all of the law firms and universities that early in this Trump 2 administration folded to sort of threatening coercive moves or hostage letters type mafioso governance. They may have not had to do that, right? It signals that actually there's going to be some sort of consumer and base support. You could coordinate with other institutions. They folded pretty early, sort of like liberal law firms, universities, other media firms. So that's part of it. At the same time, it's important to recognize that these things have ramped up. We did see January 6th, 2021, an attempted coup. And we did see Trump call the Secretary of State's office in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, and try to pressure, find me some votes, and try to subvert the presidential election. And there was pretty bipartisan support at the moment, and massive Fortune 500 firms saying, we're done with this party. And then it didn't have any teeth to it. And now we're here now in a much deeper competitive authoritarian moment. So both, you need to do both, not overstate the, threat, especially for people who are somewhat insulated, as you said, have the ability to land somewhat on their feet, even if the administration comes after them, as well as be real about the ramping up of authoritarian moves and violations of the Constitution. Everything I sort of said before, from Doge to ICE, pretty explicitly violates, for example, congressionally appropriated funds, and impounding them, it violates Article 1 of the Constitution. All of those need to be clear as well. So it's balanced.
You use the political science terms, and I think it's worth breaking down. We're moving from like liberal democracy to
Right.
competitive authoritarianism. Like, say a little bit about what that means.
Yeah. So I think there is a good analogy. Let me make sure I'm not freezing up on you. Good analogy to Hungary's Orban, a competitive authoritarian regime. Orban may lose the next election. That's part of why it's competitive authoritarianism, is that there are still elections and there's still a chance, the competitive authoritarian regime can lose
So
elections.
Putin would be non-competitive authoritarianism. Is that a right way to think about this?
I would say that's very consolidated
Yeah, it's consolidated.
form of it. And part of competitive authoritarianism is the deck is stacked, or the playing field is incredibly tilted in these elections. For example, if every media and social media firm is kind of owned by allies of the regime, that stacks the deck. Plus, you do things like hostile uh, midterm redistricting in favor of one party over the other to make certain voters more efficient for one party than another. All of those things kind of stack the deck. Plus, you know, sending the Department of Justice or otherwise attempting to prosecute the minority party for example, or the minority party tries to go look at an ICE facility and ends up getting arrested. Those things also scare the minority party into being less competitive as well. So all of that really stacks the deck. And I'd say the Orban Hungary analogies are very good. Like there's a lot of parallels to how Orban treated universities and media in Hungary. But then I think that I think scholars of comparative democracy, I'm a scholar of U.S. democracy mostly. I need to learn more about countries around the world, but the comparative scholars, Levitsky and Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, these sorts of scholars, uh, it's been tough to hear, but they say we're beyond Orban. So we have the Orban media and sort of university and civil society strategy of sort of mafioso governance against, hey, nice company you got there. Would be a shame if something were to happen to it. You better be down with the regime. Plus, you have a security state and an ICE lack of due process, sending domestically sending troops into cities for intimidation purposes. Those do go a bit beyond Orbanism.
Beyond Orban. Wow.
Yeah, so that's a sobering thing to hear. At the same time, uh, you know, there's huge resistance from civil society, lack of popularity in the regime, mostly because of the economy, the implementation of tariffs, plus I think way overstepping immigration enforcement, plus Doge and so forth, and cuts, and budgetary opposition to sort of an upward transfer of wealth and budgets. All of those mean that this this is an important moment where people should feel emboldened to speak out, and that complying in advance is essentially not necessary, except for people like in very marginalized positions.
You mentioned sort of authoritarians don't like polling and public. I hadn't really thought about it that way. Like in some ways, like the amount of polling out there itself is sort of a guard. The amount of polling showing Trump is unpopular is something of a protection for us, or is this something useful for us?
Well, I would say it's more just about the recognition that there is a majority in the country that doesn't like this, and like it's hard to arrest everybody who doesn't like it. And that's something just really important to keep in mind. And Trump recently did say these are my best polling numbers ever. This administration soaring. Um, and you do see both fraudulent election results in authoritarian regimes to show, I the
We are popular,
we
actually.
won 98% of the vote.
Right.
It was a great mandate, and then sort of polling results as well. But there's a great new, I'm blanking on the name, great new economics job market paper by a grad student I was just reviewing that looks at Russian media and the use of the library. And as Putin consolidated power, there's not good polling out there to show resistance to Putin, but people actually go and seek out literature about authoritarian regimes as the regime consolidated itself, showing like this was a little undercover way of finding resistance in Russian society and people's ability to see other people, and have solidarity with each other in a moment like that is absolutely crucial to not feel totally alone in such a situation. This is true with people who are worried about a lack of due process with ICE as well. Seeing that others are invested in their stories is incredibly important.
Let me switch gears a little bit and talk about the Democratic Party and sort of what's going on there. Like, so to say it in the most simple terms possible, if you look at, there's a new think tank called Searchlight. There's a new publication called The Argument. There's a lot of I think Ezra Klein said that Democrats need to run more anti-abortion candidates in red states, even though they've done that. Just to be clear, living in Kentucky. But anyway, so there's basically the subtext here is the Democrats need to move to the right to win elections, particularly on quote unquote social issues. Talk about that. What you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say there's a big, long-term, I guess, talking point, which is that, okay, if the stakes of politics are this high, it's about authoritarianism versus democracy and everything's on the line, then wouldn't you compromise on every issue in order to win some sort of median voter? I think that's, first of all, like that premise is incredibly problematic and destructive because there's no anti-authoritarian strategy that involves just win every election, especially as the deck gets increasingly stacked institutionally under competitive authoritarianism. Like this sort of, well, just make sure you win every election to prevent authoritarianism is like, it's not a viable thing in any context around the world in any point in history. You have to think about elite strategy. Um, and you have to think about coalition building, what we're talking about with media and universities and activists and so forth. But then let's actually zoom in. Let's take that premise. Okay, it's all about winning elections in this context. What we're really seeing in the Trump era this past decade now, like, my students, my undergrads, they only know the Trump era. Like this has been a long time now.
It's been 10 years,
And
more than almost 10 years. Yeah. Yeah.
in the Trump era, like the connections, the traditional connections between policy agendas and economic performance and voting, we typically think, okay, you vote for a policy platform looking forward, you like this policy platform, and you vote to reward doing politicians who do well with the economy and kick out the bastards who don't, right? Those are the two forms of like, you know, prospective and retrospective voting. Both of those have really frayed, and it's become a lot harder to understand vote choice around policy or economic performance over the past decade. People are voting, you know, for all sorts of reasons, perceptions of Trump and non-Trump policy positions that don't come true, right? I'm sure a lot of the viewers and yourself have seen people who are like, wow, I am shocked that this is happening. Now I don't like these tariffs. It's like, that was the platform. Like they
Yes.
wrote this down and you're
Yes.
surprised now. So that's part is the disconnect. People perceive policy agendas as different than they are. People perceive the economy differently, especially in this post-COVID era since 2021. So the point there is that we actually are in a very uncertain time. Infrequent voters are voting all over the place, and it's a very low trust environment. So the traditional left right spectrum and going moderate on issues, it's just not as clear anymore. In some highly salient policy areas, compromises, all coalitions need to compromise some policies and take some principled stands on things that don't have majority support to make them get majority support. So we can say that about any issue. It was a funny moment. The Ezra Klein mention of running pro-life Democrats is a little confusing because abortion rights, especially post-Dobbs, are incredibly popular. This is not like there's trans athletes in NCAA sports polls quite poorly, and there's absolutely a rationale for keeping that in the agenda as a principled stance on a sort of issue of rights and liberties. And there's a compromise logic here. The point is, it's very uncertain, and anybody that's selling you I can win the election by tweaking the position is kind of selling you something. And that's the rise of these think tanks that are extremely well funded to tell candidates and donors what they already want to hear. And the reality is it's highly uncertain. And the big issues are the Democrats lack credibility, lack leadership. And, my colleague Adam Bonica is pushing a line that, right now voters are extremely concerned about corruption, and the Democrats should, to win low trust voters who hate both parties and hate the system, who are these infrequent sort of voters that are all over the place that are not really voting on policy positions often, that you need to be credibly anti-corruption in all forms. That's anti-quid pro quo, sort of bribery and crypto, meme coin stuff, anti-big money in politics and all the spam texts you get, anti sort of insider trading among members of Congress in equity markets, and sort of be a clean governance party is one thing that's sort of off. That's not like a left-right spectrum thing, but in this context seems very important.
Let me probe and so I ask the question. So, if you got a list of the people who have won in purple or red areas, you get a lot of people who vote against the Democratic Party. You get some Joe Manchin, who I think at some point called himself pro-life. You get John Bel Edwards, who won Louisiana as the governor, and he's pro-life too. You get a lot of these Democrats in Congress who say, I oppose Medicare for all, or Jared Golden in Maine. So you get a lot of, there are very few AOCs in purple districts. There's a ton of these kinds of the left is too loud, left critics in red. And so in some ways, I think what these guys are saying, I think they're making a correlation causation mistake, but in some ways, I think what they're saying is, since all the people who are in red and purple areas are moderate in the way we say, the way to win is to be moderate in the way we say. I think that's what they're getting at. It's worth engaging. There aren't a lot of AOCs in Wisconsin. I think that's fair to say. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
That's right. No,
yeah.
so I think that's part of the issue here is that actually, already there's a strategy of purple districts do run moderates, especially on the Democratic side. This is something where, in theory, we don't observe it, but running the squad in West Virginia would probably not work out. But also, the Manchin story is a great one, too, where, yes, Manchin, it's important that he was more moderate on issues like guns in West Virginia, very salient issue among West Virginia voters. At the same time, Joe Manchin's replacement was similarly moderate and got absolutely destroyed in the Senate election, not because he's moderate, but because he was not Joe Manchin and didn't build up this 25-year brand in West Virginia politics as, having this quite unique brand. This is different than Sinema, where Sinema didn't have to be so centrist to vote against the Democratic platform in the same way with her electorate. But it's true that, moderates run in purple districts, and in heavily blue districts, we don't talk as much about the sort of out of step centrist. So Richie Torres in New York, very solid blue area, not purple at all.
Right.
And he takes centrist positions because of parts of his network and activists and donors in his base. And that's kind of out of step with his voters. We don't talk about that as much. But the point here is that we actually, overall don't observe a causal effect. This is something I and my co-author Bonica work on, and there's a bunch of political science on this. In this era, you don't see much movement. Making a Democratic candidate go more centrist doesn't seem to help. And that's in part, as you said, because already you have moderates running in these conservative districts. But again, one other additional crucial point why in this era you don't see this, it's not this easy like thing in a lab where you can turn some dial and say, get the exact right amount of moderation for your district. And the reason there, we saw this a little bit with Kamala Harris, where she really did run a moderate campaign as I'm a tough on crime prosecutor. But it's really like voters want to feel a sense of credibility, regardless of the policy positions. And when you do that sort of, okay, I'm optimizing my platform based on the latest polling, voters can kind of smell that as not that legit. So I would say the big thing is it's uncertain. Be yourself, you know, let a thousand flowers bloom. And this like very easy answer that you can tweak this dial towards centrism and win median voters is not the case. And this is true. Again, research shows that actually with survey respondents, if you inform them about the party's policy positions, they actually end up changing their opinions. As people have a perception, for example, the Democrats never ran on defund the police. Joe Biden famously at the State of the Union is like, we're funding the police more. Kamala Harris doubles down on this in her campaign, and yet still, voters don't perceive that. They went extremely tough on immigration in 2022 and 2023. That did not end up mattering. And I love, these attempts. Another one is like Latinx. Like some Democrats said that in the year 2021 for like 2 months. It ended then. And still you know, major political science paper showing that still has ramifications that people still perceive, wow, Democrats
Well,
woke.
let me just push back and say, I guess the counter argument would be that if no Democrat ever said, if nobody ever said defund the police, Latinx, Biden cracked on immigration in 2021, then maybe Harris. I think that's the argument. It's basically like, and in fact, they're saying it's like the things Kamala Harris said in 2019 because the groups made her do it, is why she lost. In some ways, they agree with you that maybe the party's perception can't be set quickly. Their claim is, in some ways, they're trying to end the Democratic primary right now for 2028 by saying you can only say these pre-approved blah statements. I think that so their point is consistent, and they're saying like the centrism works, and the more centrist you are, and the earlier you are centrist, the more that's what they're saying, right?
Yeah, I think there's something to this where finding candidates who like have extreme message consistency across the board in all directions does tend to pay off. But we should also remember like things have changed so much. If you remember 2016, Bernie Sanders was considered the extreme extremist, not the centrist. And now they're saying, okay, you kind of can use a more economic populism that counts as moderate now. So the terrain has greatly shifted in that way. But I'll also say, in the age of social media, you cannot have message discipline over an entire activist space across the country.
Okay.
That's not true with Gaza protesters. That's not true with, criminal justice reformer types. That's just something you can't do. At the same time, perceptions of what the party stands for, like there's an incredibly robust conservative media ecosystem that is very effective. Like it's brilliant to take a social media post by like a lib or like a viral video from a campus of somebody saying, look what this entire coalition stands for, like some wacky thing that was said on social media by somebody.
Yeah.
But this is a massive national political party with tens of millions of members, and that's not possible. So in this age, I do think like there's it a little bit plays into the conservative hands by, having a whole cottage industry of liberal pundits also go like, yeah, like that was totally bad, rather than just kind of moving on and being like, it's a huge country. And let's actually look at what the National Party stands for in office, which is
I
very.
think it's you said an important point, like back in Western Union, where you were saying the person who ran, who's the Democrat who ran instead of Manchin, ran on a very Manchin-like platform and got killed. What we don't get covered is plenty of the moderates who won are they are the survivors, but there are plenty of moderate candidates who lost. In fact, this pro-life thing. Yes, a quarter of the Democrats were pro-life, I think, in 2010. Those people did not lose because they were primaried by AOC in Little Rock. They lost because they were defeated by Republicans.
We're living in time, and the realignment of the South and then later mostly like deindustrialized places in the Southeast and the Midwest that have realigned towards the Republican Party. This has taken decades. If you read Eric Schickler's Racial Realignment, for example, you see starting in the New Deal, you start to see Southern realignment, Southern whites move towards the Republican Party, Northern Black and liberal and union sort of activists moving towards the Democratic Party. This takes decades and it's still happening. Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, they had Democratic state legislatures through the 2000s and sometimes 2010s.
Wow, yeah.
Like, that's remarkable, right? Like, at the state level, it was not part of the nationalization of the parties into two national teams. The liberal team and conservative team took decades, and it's still having its last little gasps. So what we're doing is we're seeing those few survivors, the old conservative Democrats that, you cannot simply replace. Again, this is why this I'm saying this as a quant. You want to have this, in a lab, we can put a dash of pro-life and a dash of this, and we'll create the perfect, mutant candidate who's perfect for the district. That doesn't actually work. What does work is being a conservative Democrat from the 90s and surviving the times, right? As the world changes. You can't really redo that now in time. And that's just an unfortunate part of the nationalization and realignment of politics for now a century. And that's, again, this is why I'm saying, like, in this moment, it's just highly uncertain. Run based on principled commitments, and you see this is how you get the Trump Mamdani voter, right? Is like, these are people that are running in a low trust environment, infrequent voters who hate both parties and don't trust them. And occasionally you get somebody who signals a deeper sort of credibility and commitment to issues. That's really all we know at this point. At the same time, there's some obvious things, right? Again, you don't want to run on ban all hunting rifles in West Virginia, and same thing in New York. You don't want to run on, ending abortion. These are all true things, but within realistic margins, like where candidates can move, we actually don't know. And this is like the easy way out. The harder thing we need to know is how to build civil society resistance to authoritarianism, how to coordinate. Much harder question. The attempted easy way out is just tweak your policy platform or ideology in this way. I have to run and catch my train
you should go. Yes.
But let's close it out. This is great conversation, Perry.
Jake, thanks for joining me. This was great. Have a good trip back, and we'll have you on again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Perry. Great talking with you.
Bye-bye.